Ni hao, sixth graders, and welcome to our first lesson for the second week of Digital Social Studies. Today we're going to go back and go over some material that we talked about last week. First of all, a weekend has passed in the intervening time, and we tend to forget things over the weekend. And furthermore, it's been a crazy week. There's been a lot of adjustments, and I've been really proud of how diligent you guys have been in maintaining your composure during this pretty stressful time period. So we're going to go back and go over some stuff we've already talked about. I'm not too concerned with rushing through the material at this time. I'm more concerned with making sure that everyone's on the same page. So we're going to take it a little bit slow. If you are still frustrated and feel like there are things you're not understanding, remember that you can always reach out to me by email. And if you really need a one-on-one, we can have a one-on-one Zoom and we can talk about what challenges you're having and how to get you to where you want to be. If you have concerns and you don't want to do a one-on-one talk, we do have that meeting on Thursday via Zoom. We're going to talk about some class stuff there, but it's also a good time for you to bring up your concerns, because if there's something that you're challenged with right now, if there's something that's proving difficult for you, chances are at least one of your classmates is also struggling, and bringing it up in the full class group might be a chance not only for you to feel like, okay, I'm not the only one who's behind, but also a chance for me to hear from multiple people that there's a support you guys need. Anyway, we're going to start today by talking about something we already talked about a little bit, the Warring States period. So if you remember, we're talking about the period of Chinese history when, in theory at least, China was ruled by the powerful Zhou dynasty, a dynasty of kings that ruled the northern plains and a little bit of the southern hills. These kings at first were very, very powerful. They claimed the mandate of heaven, that is the permission of the gods to rule China. But over time, people started to feel like they'd let the mandate slip. There were natural disasters that they weren't prepared for, and battles that they lost. And the understanding was that if you lost battles or encountered difficult natural disasters, then the gods were saying that you didn't have the permission to rule China anymore. So increasingly, there were powerful nobles within China who were supposed to pay taxes to the king, but kind of stopped doing that. And eventually, those powerful nobles started calling themselves kings, started claiming that they wanted the mandate of heaven. And this is exactly what the political philosopher Confucius was afraid of. He was alive a little bit before this time, and he feared that if the nobles did not respect the Zhou kings, and if the kings did not properly take care of their people, that eventually this entire political relationship and social relationship called feudalism would fall apart. And sure enough, it did. By 475 and until 221 BCE, China was divided into 7 different kingdoms, all fighting each other for power. There were the Qin, the Zhao, the Yan, the Qi, the Wei, the Han, and the Chu. And then, of course, in the middle there, the Zhou kings, who still claimed to be the rulers of all of China, but in reality didn't have much, if any, power here. Now, the reason that these kingdoms were just fighting each other and nobody conquered the Zhao just yet is because they knew that whoever was the first person to jump and attack the Zhao and try to claim the mandate, they would be weakened from that battle, and then would be easy prey for another one of the 7 kingdoms. So there was kind of like a standoff here where each one of them wanted power from the other, but they weren't really willing to really leap for it just yet. This is called the Warring States period because China was divided into small kingdoms called states, and they were always at war with one another. In the end, though, of all these kingdoms, it was the kingdom of Qin that had 3 distinct advantages, which was going to let it win the Warring States period and emerge victorious and be able to claim the mandate of heaven. The 3 advantages that the Qin had, which we'll talk about in further detail on 3 different slides, were its geography, what the actual landscape of the state of Qin looked like, its government, which we talked about a little bit already, but we'll talk about it later, and its leadership, which we haven't discussed yet either. So we're going to talk about those 3 categories. I know we've already discussed one of them, government, in order to talk about legalism, but we'll do a review of legalism. We might as well. It's a tough concept and an important one. But first, let's talk about the geography of the state of Qin. What about the physical landscape of Qin gave it an advantage over its rivals? Well, so what I want you to do right now is I want you to go to your daily questions Word document. And in that document, there is a question which asks you to look at this map here and decide what you think the advantages that the state of Qin had. So I'm going to ask you in a moment to pause this video and go to your Word document and answer those questions. Then when you come back, we'll discuss together. So go ahead and pause your video now and answer those questions. Did you answer them? Okay, good. So welcome back, and let's discuss the advantages that Qin had. Now, you got a little bit of information on this map, and you might have been able to make some crucial guesses by looking at the legend, by looking at, in particular, that fortified border up north, and the cities and the towns, and maybe also the rivers. So let's see what you were able to intuit. So one big advantage that the state of Qin had was, quite simply put, it's big. You'll notice that there is really only one other state on this map that is anything like the size of Qin. That is the state of Chu. The state of Zhao up in the north is fairly similar in size, but still a little bit smaller. And the advantage of having a big state is that enemy armies had to march a lot to get across it. So if you came to the border of Qin, let's say you're trying to invade the state of Qin from the state of Wei, you have to march across a huge area of land to conquer all of that state. So basically, having a big state made it so that enemy armies got exhausted marching around instead of doing what they really needed to do, which was fighting. So it was really hard to invade the state of Qin because of this. Also, unlike some of the other states, Qin only had one border to defend. If you look, you'll see that yes, it's a very long border, but it's just one. If the Qin armies were all stationed roughly along that border, then there was no risk of the Qin being attacked by a rival warring state from behind, or from the north, or from the south. It was only that eastern border that they needed to concern themselves with. If you look at some of the other states, they don't have that advantage. The state of Zhao up in the north, they had a southern border with Wei and an eastern border with Yan and Qi. That meant that they had basically 2 borders to defend against 3 enemies. If you look below them at the state of Wei, Wei had a border with the Qin, with the Zhao, with the Han, with the Qi, and with the Chu on all sides, not to mention their border with the Zhao, although that doesn't matter so much. So the Qin had this really nice advantage that it was easy for them to station their armies so as to defend their border, and even if they fell back from their border, those enemies had to march further to get across this very big state. Another advantage that the Qin had was their difficult terrain. Now that's not represented on this map, but if you looked and you saw the Yangtze River in the south there, you should know that the Yangtze River is the major river that runs through the southern hills. So the southern part of the state of Qin is actually in the southern hills, the southernmost part of China at this time period. And the southern hills are some difficult terrain. And so in the worst case scenario, if their armies were pushed back from their border, and if their large area of land in the north was marched across and invaded successfully, the state of Qin, they could simply retreat to the southern hills, where their enemy would have to come and attack them and be at a significant disadvantage marching into those difficult hills. The only other state here that has the southern hills in its territory is the state of Chu. All the others are in the northern plain, which are relatively easy to march through. And crucially, you'll notice how spread out the cities of the state of Qin are. No other warring state has this feature. Even the very large state of Chu, its cities are fairly centralized along the Huai River, with just a couple along the coast. These are the major cities or towns of these states, and as you can see, almost all of the cities in the state of Qin are really spread out, which makes it difficult to conquer it. Again, enemies are going to have to march across this huge area of land, and the only time that they're going to be able to take cities is every now and then when they come to these big fortified settlements. And then they'll take the cities and get the supplies they need, but then they'll have to march a huge distance to get to the next one. And by the time they get to the next city, well, maybe the Qin have already looped around them and reconquered that city. So this was a pretty big advantage for Qin. And these advantages were going to make it very difficult for the Qin to be conquered. And that meant that the Qin was going to always be able to be on the attack, Essentially, all of these advantages make it so that nobody wants to fight the Qin. Think about it. You don't want to attack their border because their army's always there. You don't want to march across their land because it's so big. You don't want to have to go through the difficult terrain. You don't want to have to conquer all these spread out cities. And so you just don't attack the state of Qin. It's foolish to do so, which means that the Qin never really had to worry so much about defending themselves, not as much as the other states did. They could focus on conquering their rivals. And the only way to win the Warring States period, to claim the mandate of heaven, it's not to defend yourself, it's to conquer. So let's talk about the Qin government. We talked about this government last time, but I want to go over it. We're going to be talking about legalism again. So last time we mentioned that just like all of the other warring states, the Qin state used a hereditary monarchy form of government, meaning that there was one ruler, usually called a king, who acquired his power by inheriting it, usually from his father. And all the warring states had this government system, so that was not the advantage that the Qin had in their government. The advantage was the political philosophy used by their government. Remember, a political philosophy is an idea about how or why a government exists. What is the purpose of government? What should a government do in order to achieve its goals? Confucius suggested a political philosophy in which the purpose of government existing was one of social relationships. That there was a king who existed because people needed to respect him and because he needed to take care of his people. It was kind of like the relationship within a family for Confucius. The king was like a father, the people of China were his children. The children obey the father governs the children. But the Qin philosopher Shang Yang, he disagreed with Confucianism and made up a political philosophy, a reason for government to exist, that was quite the opposite of Confucianism. Shang Yang said that people didn't obey rules just because it was the right thing to do. He said, you can't tell the people of China that you are the children of the king, so you have to listen to them. He said, people will still break the laws, just like children will still disobey their parents. He said that people only obey laws if forced to obey them, or only obey if forced to obey, and that meant that laws were necessary to force obedience, not morality. He suggested that laws be used to punish rebellion and to reward loyalty. So if someone broke the rules, they needed to be punished for it, so they feared breaking the rules, which would keep them in line. And if someone followed the rules, they needed to be rewarded for it, so that they would be encouraged to continue to follow the rules and would encourage others to follow the rules, because people would look and say, hey, look, that guy followed the rules and he got this really important job. So that they would want to follow the rules too. And the idea was to use this system to force China to unite. Shang Yang said there's no way we're going to just be able to ask all the other warring states to let China come together. That's not going to happen. So the only way to unite China is through force, and the best people to unite China through force, he thought, were the Qin. So as a result, the Qin government tended to promote loyal soldiers and government officials, not just ones who were senior and who came from ancient families. And this was a really big deal, because if you promoted people just because of their age or because of their connections to ancient families, they might not always be loyal to you, which might mean that you might have trouble collecting taxes or commanding your armies. But if you promote people who are loyal to you and you punish people who fail to be loyal, who plot against you, then that's going to create a system in which you have stronger control over your army and your government, which made the state of Qin a lot more powerful than its rivals. And also, the state of Qin didn't feel like they needed to fight with honor. You see, the other states felt like they had to obey certain sets of rules, like don't ambush your enemy. If your enemy is starving in a city that you're attacking, let them leave and get food so that they can fight fairly. The Qin said that's ridiculous. They said that the ends justify the means, which is to say that whatever your goal is, if it is a worthwhile goal, if it is a good goal that will be the best for the people, then you can do whatever you need to do to achieve that goal. Shang Yang and the legalist philosophers of the Qin state, they said If we have to do horrible things to unite China and bring peace to the warring states, then those horrible things are worth it because peace in China is worth it. So let's talk about Qin leadership. Who was in charge of the Qin? Well, we already know what kind of government they had, a hereditary monarchy. But as a result of legalism, the Qin government actually had very skilled, loyal generals, people who were willing to fight for them. This is a depiction of one of those generals, as shown in the Terracotta Army, something that we'll talk about later this week. One of the most important kings of the Qin state is a king called Zheng. Zheng was a king who ruled between who was born about 249 BC and died in about 210 BCE. Here he is depicted in traditional garb. I'll talk a little bit about the outfit that he's wearing because it's quite interesting. So first of all, that crown that he's wearing on his head with the sort of curtain in the front and in the back, that is because in this period of Chinese history, it was believed that most people were not worthy of looking directly at the king or the emperor, as the case may be. That made it difficult because traditionally people were expected to keep their heads bowed down low and to talk to the king without looking at his eyes. But that made it difficult to move around. And so this kind of crown was conceived as a way to make sure that you could look at the king's face directly, but between you and the king, there was this sort of curtain or a veil there that made it so that you were not actually directly looking at him. And it sort of got around that rule of don't look directly at the king. You can look directly at him because there's something between you. And it's just made of beads, so you can see through it. You can't see fully through it, so you're not making direct eye contact with him. You'll also notice that on his robes, he has a dragon depicted there. Dragons were, in Chinese mythology, dragons are not the same as they are in, for example, European mythology. In European mythology, dragons are often symbols of evil, and they're things that have to be killed, usually by knights, right? In Chinese mythology, dragons are special gods, usually associated with powerful bodies of water, especially the sea. And these gods, while they are frightening at times and they can be very vengeful and bring storms if they're angry, they're ultimately good protective gods, and they are associated with the rulers of China. Traditionally, throughout Chinese history, only someone who has claimed the mandate of heaven is allowed to wear the symbol of a dragon on his clothing. For someone else to do so would be effectively them claiming that they're the king of China. So King Zheng became the king of the state of Qin at the age of only 13, but others ruled for him until he was 22. We've seen this in other cultures where a king takes the throne at a very young age and can't rule themselves, and so others rule. Oftentimes, this seems to result in the king never quite having full power, in the people who ruled for him, whether it be advisors or his mother or a cousin, in those people always kind of clinging on to power. During the rule of King Zheng, he followed all the tenets of legalism. He did not obey notions of honor. He was known to attack his enemies during natural disasters. So if a fire or an earthquake destroyed a village, he would go in and attack them anyway. He would destroy villages that he conquered that refused his rule. So if he conquered a place and they said, hey, we don't want to submit to your rule, he would just say, all right, I'm going to get rid of the whole village then. And he would kill enemy kings who surrendered, which was a really big no-no. By 221 BCE, he had defeated the last of the other warring states and claimed the mandate of heaven. This was the territory that he ruled once he had done so. So he ruled all of the northern plain as well as some of the southern hills. But that wasn't the only territory that he ruled, because after he finished conquering all of China, he received tribute from parts of modern-day Vietnam. So there's the southern hills, and then in blue there, that's the territory that he received tribute from. So he ruled the territory here in red and in green, but he also received tribute or payments from the area in blue, effectively making it part of his sphere of influence, if not his empire. Even the very name for China comes from the state that he ruled. And so this is arguably going to be the most important ruler in ancient Chinese history, because even when we talk about the country today, we are saying it is, when we say China, we are calling it the country of Qin. And something that this King Zheng is going to do is going to make it so that the very idea of a unified China sort of begins with his rule. We will talk about that, though, in our next video. I appreciate you all paying attention and continuing to listen to these lecture videos, even though I know they're not quite the same as our in-class meetings. Again, though, this week on Thursday, we have our Zoom meeting. I'm very excited to see all of your bright and smiling faces. And this is a good time for us to just kind of chat, make sure that we're all on the same page. Please come with any questions you have. You should have already answered your daily question for today. So please go ahead and make sure that you do that if you have not already done so. And I will see you for tomorrow's video about Qin Shi Huangdi. See you then.